As Sergeant Marcus Turner returns home from his tour of duty, the last thing he expects is flashing blue lights and a police officer accusing him of a crime he didn't commit. What should have been a simple traffic stop spirals into an ordeal that will shake the entire town. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's jump into the story. It was a warm summer afternoon, the kind of day that usually lifted Marcus Turner's spirits. The sun had barely begun to dip in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the narrow roads of Ridgeview. A town so small, most people knew each other by name, and where the returning of a local hero like Marcus should have been a celebrated event. But as he drove down Maple Street, wearing his freshly pressed Army uniform, the feeling of joy that had accompanied him since stepping off the plane was quickly replaced by something heavier, a growing sense of unease. Marcus hadn't been home in over a year, returning from a long deployment overseas. His last tour had been difficult, but he had faced challenges before. As a sergeant, he was used to the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership. Still, nothing could have prepared him for the way his life was about to change. Not all because of one moment that seemed so insignificant at first, a routine traffic stop. He had been driving his family's old sedan, a reliable car but nothing fancy. It had served them well for years. And today, it was meant to carry him home to surprise his wife, Lena, and their 10-year-old daughter, Jasmine. He could already picture the look on their faces when he walked through the door, especially Jasmine, who had been counting the days until her father's return. But before Marcus could let his mind wander too far into that warm vision, he noticed the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. His stomach tightened. A police cruiser was tailing him, the lights spinning urgently. He immediately pulled over to the side of the road, instinctively putting both hands on the steering wheel. It was a reflex, something he had done countless times during his years in the military. Stay calm. Stay respectful. Things would be fine. But as Officer Tom Harris approached his window, there was something about the man's demeanor that set Marcus on edge. Officer Harris was tall, with a build that seemed made for intimidation, his expression hard and unfriendly. He had been on the Ridgeview police force for years, and his reputation preceded him, though not for reasons that anyone was proud of. Harris had a history of treating people of color with an extra layer of suspicion, but in a town as small as Ridgeview, complaints against him had never gone far. People whispered about it, but no one had ever stood up to him. "License and registration?" Harris barked, his voice curt and demanding. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his glove compartment for the documents. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, watching every movement as if Marcus were a threat. "Here you go, officer," Marcus said, keeping his tone calm. "Is there a problem?" Harris ignored the question, flipping through Marcus's paperwork with a frown. He stared at the Army ID for a long moment before finally responding. "You were driving suspiciously slow back there. What are you up to?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "I'm just on my way home, sir. I wasn't aware I was driving unusually slow." "You military types think you can come back here and do whatever you want?" Harris shot back, his voice growing sharper. "Where's this car from?" Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel, but he kept his voice steady. "It's my family's car. We've lived here for years." Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting on the baton at his side. At this point, Marcus's heart was pounding. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. But he knew better than to argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, careful to keep his hands visible at all times. As soon as Marcus was out of the vehicle, Harris began circling him, inspecting both him and the car with unnecessary scrutiny. "Is this really your car?" Harris asked again, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Seems a little too nice for someone like you." Marcus felt a spark of anger flicker in his chest. He had spent his entire life serving his country, upholding the law and protecting people like Officer Harris. But here he was, being treated as if his very existence was a problem. "It is my car, officer," Marcus repeated firmly. "I'm not sure what you're looking for, but everything is in order." Harris stepped closer, his face only inches from Marcus's. "I'll be the judge of that." Hands on the hood. Marcus hesitated. This wasn't right. He had seen traffic stops before, even been pulled over once or twice in his younger days, but this was different. There was no reason for this escalation. "Officer," Marcus said carefully, trying to de-escalate the situation, "I don't understand what the issue is. I've complied with all your requests." But his words fell on deaf ears. Harris pulled out his handcuffs. "You can explain it downtown, hands on the hood." The air around them seemed to freeze, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't going to resist, but he wasn't going to allow himself to be wrongfully arrested without reason. "With all due respect, Officer Harris, what's the charge?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady even as the tension grew. Harris's eyes narrowed. "Resisting arrest," he snapped, stepping forward to grab Marcus's arm. The moment felt surreal. Marcus's mind raced, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. A small crowd had begun to gather nearby, neighbors who recognized Marcus watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and concern. The air was thick with tension, and as Marcus looked into the crowd, he could see people pulling out their phones, recording the incident. Marcus wasn't a stranger to danger or conflict, but this was different. This was happening in his own hometown, in front of the very people who had known him since he was a boy. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this happen. Not like this. Just as Harris reached for Marcus's wrist to cuff him, Marcus instinctively pulled back, raising his hands in the air. "I'm not resisting," he said loudly, making sure the growing crowd could hear him. Harris's face twisted in anger. "Get on the ground," he shouted, his voice rising in frustration. Before things could escalate further, more police cars arrived, their sirens blaring as they pulled up to the scene. 2 more officers stepped out, and for a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope that perhaps they would intervene and defuse the situation. But as they approached, their faces were tense, their hands hovering near their holsters. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Marcus knew it. He had always believed in the system, in the justice he had fought to protect. But standing there on the side of the road, in his own hometown, Marcus began to realize that sometimes the system could be blind to the very people it was meant to serve. As Harris moved in again, Marcus braced himself, wondering just how far this nightmare was going to go. And as the sound of phones recording the incident filled the air, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, the whole town would soon know. The night air in the Ridgeview police station was heavy, oppressive even. It smelled of stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh, cold glow over everything. Marcus sat alone in a holding cell, still in disbelief over how the day had unfolded. His hands ached from the tight handcuffs that had only just been removed, and his mind was racing. Everything that had happened felt unreal, as if he were watching someone else's life play out on a screen. Earlier that day, he had imagined a quiet evening at home with his family, enjoying the comfort of being back in familiar surroundings. Instead, he found himself sitting in a cold steel cage, his dignity stripped away by a man who seemed determined to see him as a threat, rather than the man who had served his country with honor. The absurdity of it all stung, but it wasn't just about the embarrassment or even the anger, it was about the injustice. The door to the cell block opened with a loud creak, and Marcus looked up to see Officer Harris walking toward him, a smug expression plastered across his face. Behind him trailed 2 younger officers, both of them looking uneasy, as if they were caught in something they didn't fully understand or agree with. Harris, on the other hand, was confident, almost eager. "Here he is," Harris said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Our big hero." Marcus remained silent, staring straight ahead. He had dealt with far worse than Harris in his military career, but the fact that this was happening on American soil in his own town made it sting more than any enemy he had faced abroad. "You know, Turner," Harris continued, leaning against the bars of the cell, "guys like you think you're untouchable because you wear a uniform. But out here, we make the rules. And I don't care how many medals you've got pinned to your chest, you're just another thug to me." Marcus clenched his fists, but he didn't rise to the bait. He had learned long ago that some battles were better fought with patience. But Harris wasn't done. He pulled out a clipboard, flipping through the pages. "I filed the report," Harris said. "You're looking at resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order, and reckless endangerment. Might even throw in suspicion of a stolen vehicle. You're going to be here for a while." At that, Marcus finally spoke. "You know that's a lie, Harris." The officer's eyes gleamed, his smile widening. "That's your word against mine." A surge of frustration rose in Marcus's chest. He had cooperated fully during the stop, even when Harris had escalated without cause. And now this officer was building a narrative to justify what had been a blatant abuse of power. The injustice of it felt suffocating, but Marcus knew he had to stay calm. Harris wanted a reaction. He wanted Marcus to lose control. "What's your problem with me?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice measured. Harris's smirk faltered for a second, replaced with a flicker of something darker. "You really don't get it, do you? People like you? You think you're better than everyone else because you've got a fancy uniform and the military behind you. But out here, you're just another guy with a chip on his shoulder, looking for trouble." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I'm just trying to get home to my family." Harris straightened up, clearly irritated that Marcus wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted. "You'll get home, eventually. But first, we're going to make sure you understand who's in charge around here." With that, Harris turned on his heel and left the cell block, leaving Marcus alone once again. The other officers lingered for a moment, exchanging glances before following their superior out. Marcus could feel the weight of their uncertainty, as if they knew something wasn't right, but were too afraid or too indifferent to challenge it. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and Marcus's thoughts turned to Lena and Jasmine. They would be worried by now, wondering why he hadn't come home. The thought of his daughter, eagerly waiting for him by the front door, made his heart ache. He needed to get out of here. He needed to explain to them what had happened. Finally, the door to the cell block opened again, this time revealing a different officer, one Marcus hadn't seen before. He was younger, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in the cold, institutional environment of the police station. "Sergeant Turner," the officer said softly, stepping closer to the cell. "Your wife's here. She's with your lawyer. We're going to process your release now." Marcus blinked in surprise. "My lawyer?" The officer nodded. "Lena called her. She's good. Been fighting for guys like you for a long time." A wave of relief washed over Marcus. Lena always knew what to do. Even in moments of chaos, she was the one who held everything together. But his relief was quickly tempered by the reality that this wasn't over yet. There would be a fight ahead, and it wouldn't be easy. Marcus was led out of the cell and down the narrow hallway, where he was reunited with Lena. She stood tall, her face a mask of determination, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. Beside her stood Laura Mitchell, a sharp-looking woman in her mid-30s, wearing a tailored suit and holding a thick file under her arm. "You okay?" Lena asked, reaching for his hand. "I'm fine," Marcus said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed him. Laura stepped forward, offering her hand. "Sergeant Turner, I'm Laura Mitchell. I'll be handling your case." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the weight of the situation settling in. "Thank you for coming. I didn't know what was happening." Laura nodded. "I've already seen the report Harris filed. It's full of holes, and we have multiple witnesses who recorded the stop. We'll be able to fight this, but it's going to take time. The department's backing him, at least for now." Marcus sighed. "Of course they are." Lena squeezed his hand. "We're going to get through this. We'll clear your name." As they walked out of the station together, Marcus felt the cool night air hit his face. It was a welcome change from the stale, oppressive atmosphere inside. But as much as he wanted to put the day behind him, he knew this was only the beginning. The following morning, Ridgeview was buzzing with news of Marcus's arrest. Local news stations picked up the story, though they painted a very different picture from what had actually happened. According to Officer Harris's report, Marcus had been driving suspiciously, failed to comply with orders, and resisted arrest. It was the narrative that Harris had carefully constructed, designed to make Marcus look like a criminal rather than a victim of profiling and harassment. But the truth was out there too. Video footage taken by bystanders was already circulating on social media, showing a very different version of events. In the videos, Marcus could be seen standing calmly by his car, complying with Harris's demands, even as the officer grew more aggressive. There was no sign of resistance, no threat, only Marcus trying to make sense of the situation. The town was divided. On one side were those who believed Officer Harris's version of events, claiming that the police were just doing their job and that Marcus had brought the situation upon himself. On the other side were those who knew Marcus personally, neighbors, friends, and fellow veterans, who couldn't believe the man they knew would ever behave the way Harris had described. They had seen the videos and were outraged by what they perceived as a clear abuse of power. Protests began forming outside the police station, with people demanding justice for Marcus. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racial Profiling" were held high as crowds gathered, their voices growing louder with each passing day. The tension in Ridgeview was palpable, and it was clear that this was no longer just about one traffic stop. It was about something much bigger. As Marcus sat in his living room, watching the news coverage, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This was supposed to be a quiet homecoming, a time to reconnect with his family after months away. Instead, it had turned into a battle for his reputation, his dignity, and his future. And as the days wore on, it became clear that this fight wasn't just his. It was for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about something much bigger. The once quiet streets of Ridgeview were now the epicenter of a tense and brewing conflict. What had started as a single incident, a routine traffic stop gone horribly wrong, had ignited something much larger. The town, typically known for its close-knit, small community charm, had become a place of whispered conversations, public debates, and now, open protests. The day after Marcus's release, the first group of protesters had gathered in front of the police station. A few dozen people at first, neighbors, friends, and veterans who knew Marcus and couldn't reconcile the narrative being pushed by the police with the man they had known for years. They held signs demanding answers, chanting slogans like "Justice for Marcus" and "End the Lies." But as news spread, the crowd grew. By the third day, it wasn't just a handful of locals anymore. People from nearby towns, members of civil rights organizations, and even journalists from regional news outlets had begun to descend upon Ridgeview. The protest was growing into something much larger, and the division within the town became impossible to ignore. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the quiet backyard where Jasmine was playing with their dog. It was the only pocket of calm he had left in the chaos his life had become. Lena was in the living room on the phone, talking to Laura Mitchell, his lawyer. They were discussing the upcoming trial, strategizing for what was sure to be a long, drawn-out legal battle. But it wasn't just about the legal case anymore. It was about the town, the people, and the line that had been drawn between them. As Marcus sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from one of his Army friends, a fellow veteran who had seen the news coverage and wanted to offer support. The messages had been pouring in ever since the story broke. Old comrades, friends from other parts of the country, even strangers who had seen the videos and were outraged by what had happened. But not all the messages were supportive. Some were full of anger, accusing Marcus of playing the victim, of making trouble where there was none. Others were more subtle, implying that maybe there was more to the story than the videos showed, that perhaps Marcus had brought the situation on himself. It was a painful reminder of the division in the town and the country. The local news stations had been running the story in loops, and the police department's official statement only fueled the flames. The department had fully backed Officer Harris, calling the incident a lawful traffic stop and maintaining that Marcus had resisted arrest. Harris himself had remained quiet since the night of the arrest, but his supporters were vocal. Some residents of Ridgeview, particularly those with connections to the police force, stood firmly behind him, believing that Marcus was exaggerating the encounter to draw attention to himself. Rumors spread quickly. There were whispers in the coffee shops and at the hardware store, people saying things like, "Marcus was always a little too proud of that uniform of his," or "I heard he mouthed off to the officer, and that's why things got out of hand." It was a sharp contrast to the Marcus Turner most people in Ridgeview knew. A quiet, respectful man who had served his country honorably, who had coached Little League baseball, and who had always been a pillar of the community. But in times like these, perception could change in an instant. The division was more than just words, it was visible. The protests were met with counter-protests, and the police presence in town had grown substantially. Squad cars lined the streets near the police station, and officers in riot gear stood guard as if they were preparing for a confrontation. Tensions ran high as more people from neighboring towns arrived, some looking to support Marcus, others there to voice their support for the police. Marcus had never wanted any of this. All he had wanted was to return home, to enjoy the peace and quiet of civilian life with his family. But now his face was on every television screen, and his name was being debated by people who had never even met him. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. One evening, as Marcus and Lena sat down to dinner, the doorbell rang. Marcus went to answer it, and standing there was Pastor Williams, the leader of a small local church who had known Marcus for years. Behind him stood a group of community members, including neighbors, teachers from Jasmine's school, and a few familiar faces from the veterans group Marcus was a part of. "Sergeant Turner," Pastor Williams began, his voice gentle but firm. "We're here to let you know that the community is behind you. We've organized a peaceful march for justice. We want to show the world that this town stands for what's right." Marcus looked at the group, their faces filled with a mixture of determination and compassion. He had never been one for public displays or protests, but seeing the support of his friends and neighbors moved him. He nodded, thanking them for their support, and agreed to speak at the march. The day of the march arrived, and the streets of Ridgeview were packed with people. It wasn't just the locals anymore. People had traveled from miles around to be there. Some held signs demanding justice for Marcus. Others held up signs calling for broader reforms in policing. The atmosphere was charged but peaceful, the crowd determined to make their voices heard without violence. Marcus stood at the front, Lena by his side, his hand resting on her shoulder. He had never imagined himself in this position, standing in front of a crowd, not as a soldier or a leader in the military, but as a man fighting for his own dignity and the truth. It felt surreal, but it also felt necessary. As the march began to move through the streets, chants of "Justice for Marcus" echoed off the brick buildings. The group made its way toward the police station, where a line of officers stood in riot gear, watching the crowd closely. The tension was thick in the air, but Marcus kept his focus on the marchers, on the people who had come to support him. When they arrived at the police station, Marcus stepped forward to speak. The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I never wanted this," Marcus began, his voice strong but measured. "I never wanted to be standing here, fighting for something that should be a given: dignity, respect, justice. But here we are." He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar, others were strangers, but they were all here for the same reason. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's something that happens to people who look like me far too often, and it needs to stop." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't done. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about making sure that everyone in this town, in this country, is treated with fairness and respect. It's about making sure that our children grow up in a place where they don't have to be afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect them." He glanced at the line of police officers, standing stiff and unmoving. "This is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone." The march continued peacefully, but the division in the town was clear. As Marcus and Lena walked home that night, arm in arm, they passed small groups of people who stood on their porches, watching in silence. Some nodded in support, while others turned away, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Ridgeview was changing, and not everyone was ready for it. Back at home, Marcus sat down with Lena, their hands intertwined on the kitchen table. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. Lena nodded. "But we'll get through it. Together." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring out the window into the darkness of the quiet neighborhood. He knew she was right, but the fight ahead felt enormous. The town was divided, and the battle for justice was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in Ridgeview grew increasingly charged. The March for Justice had set off a chain reaction. News outlets from across the region were covering the story, and more people were becoming aware of the town's issues with law enforcement. The protests continued, and with them, the local authorities seemed more defensive, their resolve hardening in the face of growing scrutiny. Marcus and Lena spent countless hours preparing for the upcoming trial. Laura Mitchell, their lawyer, was relentless in her pursuit of justice. She had gathered a significant amount of evidence, including video footage from bystanders during the traffic stop, witness testimonies, and even past incidents involving Officer Harris. Laura had made it clear that this trial would not just be about Marcus's wrongful arrest. It would also be a chance to expose the systemic issues within the Ridgeview Police Department. As the trial date approached, Marcus felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, anxiety, and a flicker of hope. The support from the community was unwavering, and a rally had been planned for the day of the trial. It was clear that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a movement for change. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse was packed. Supporters of Marcus filled the gallery, wearing "Justice for Marcus" buttons. Opponents were there too, some clutching signs in support of Officer Harris, determined to uphold the status quo. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge entered and called the proceedings to order. Laura began her opening statement with clarity and conviction. "Your Honor, we are here today because Sergeant Marcus Turner, a decorated Army officer, was wrongfully arrested and publicly humiliated by Officer Tom Harris. We intend to show that this incident was not an isolated case, but part of a troubling pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power." As Laura presented the evidence, including the video footage, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The footage played on a screen, showing Marcus calmly standing by his car, while Officer Harris escalated the situation without provocation. The contrast between the reality of the video and the narrative presented by Harris was stark. It painted a picture of a man who had done nothing wrong, yet was treated like a criminal. Next, Laura called witnesses to the stand: neighbors who had seen the traffic stop, veterans who knew Marcus, and even a few residents who had experienced similar interactions with Officer Harris. Each testimony added a layer to the story, creating a tapestry of injustice that resonated with the jury and the audience. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly evident that Officer Harris was struggling to defend his actions. Under cross-examination, Laura pressed him on his motivations and actions that night. "You claim that you had reason to suspect Sergeant Turner was a threat, but is it not true that you were aware he was in uniform and returning home from military service?" she challenged. Harris's responses grew more defensive. "I'm trained to assess potential threats. It's my job," he insisted, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Laura seized on this weakness. "So you admit that you based your actions on preconceived notions rather than evidence or behavior? Isn't it possible that you allowed your biases to cloud your judgment?" The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Harris floundered, searching for a response, but the damage was done. It was becoming clearer that this case was not merely about one officer's actions, but the ingrained biases that led to such behavior. As the trial entered its final days, the community buzzed with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, signs were still being held high, and the rallying cry for justice echoed through the streets. Ridgeview had become a battleground for change, a place where people were finally confronting uncomfortable truths about race and justice. On the day of the closing arguments, the tension was palpable. Laura stood before the jury, her voice steady. "This case is not just about the actions of Officer Harris on that fateful night. It is about the systems that allow such behavior to go unchecked. It is about every person who has been treated as less than, every person who has faced prejudice in a situation where they should have felt safe. Marcus Turner is not just fighting for his own dignity. He is fighting for all of us." As she spoke, Marcus felt a surge of pride. This was not just his battle. It was a shared struggle that transcended individual experiences. Lena watched from the gallery, her heart swelling with emotion as she saw her husband standing strong in the face of adversity. They had come so far together, and no matter the outcome, this journey was one they would face hand in hand. After Laura's closing argument, it was time for the defense to make its case. Officer Harris took the stand again, his demeanor shifting from aggressive to defensive. He tried to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, arguing that he had acted in the best interests of public safety. However, each word seemed to ring hollow in the face of the evidence presented against him. The defense team struggled to discredit the witnesses, attempting to paint them as biased or unreliable. But as the jury deliberated, it was clear that they had seen the same evidence everyone else had. The glaring inconsistencies in Harris's narrative, the lack of any real justification for his actions, and the overwhelming support for Marcus from the community. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone held their breath, waiting for the verdict. Marcus's heart raced, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. The foreperson stood, looking at the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sergeant Marcus Turner, not guilty of all charges." The courtroom erupted in applause, cheers, and cries of relief. Marcus felt an overwhelming rush of emotions, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes as he looked at Lena. She was beaming, her hands clasped together in prayer as she thanked the heavens. As the crowd celebrated outside the courthouse, Marcus stepped out, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. The cheers echoed in his ears, a sweet melody of vindication that washed over him like a wave. But even in his moment of triumph, he knew the battle was far from over. Officer Harris's face was a mask of anger and disbelief as he stepped out of the courthouse, flanked by officers who had once supported him. The realization that the town was no longer his to control seemed to dawn on him. For so long, he had been the one in power, the one who had silenced dissent. But now, the voices of the community rang louder than ever. As the crowd celebrated, Marcus raised his voice. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever felt unjustly treated. We must keep pushing for change. We must hold our leaders accountable and ensure that this doesn't happen again." His words resonated through the crowd, a call to action that ignited the spirits of those gathered. They were no longer merely spectators in a battle. They were participants in a movement that could reshape the future of their town. In that moment, standing amidst the cheers and tears, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that transcended his personal victory. He had become a symbol of resilience, and together with his community, they were ready to fight for a better Ridgeview, one where justice and equality reigned supreme. The aftermath of the trial left Ridgeview buzzing with a mixture of relief and tension. The verdict had been a significant victory for Marcus Turner, but the echoes of that victory reverberated far beyond the courthouse steps. The streets were alive with conversations about race, justice, and the need for change. While some residents celebrated the not guilty verdict, others dug their heels in, unwilling to accept the truth that had been laid bare in the courtroom. As days turned into weeks, the community continued to rally. But it wasn't just about Marcus's case anymore. Activists began organizing town hall meetings, inviting citizens from all walks of life to discuss the urgent need for police reform and community engagement. Marcus found himself at the forefront of these discussions, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak out about their experiences. One evening, Lena and Marcus stood in their living room, going over notes for an upcoming community meeting. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "It's incredible how many people have come forward to share their own stories," Lena said, flipping through pages of testimonials. "It's like a wave of change is starting to wash over Ridgeview." Marcus nodded, but a hint of concern lingered in his eyes. "I just hope it lasts. I don't want this to be just a moment. We need to build something sustainable, something that ensures real change." Lena reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "We will. You're not alone in this. The support we've received is overwhelming, and we can't let it fizzle out." As the meeting day approached, Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He had spoken before in front of his fellow soldiers, but this felt different. It was about confronting systemic issues, and he was determined to use his voice for those who had been silenced. The town hall meeting was held in the local community center, a place that had seen countless gatherings over the years, town meetings, holiday celebrations, and even the occasional fundraiser. But this time, the atmosphere was electric. Residents filled the seats, their faces a mixture of determination and curiosity. Banners hung on the walls, proclaiming slogans of justice, unity, and change. Marcus took a deep breath as he stepped up to the podium. He glanced over the crowd, noticing familiar faces mixed with those he had never seen before. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "This is a crucial moment for our town, for our community. We've seen how far we've come, but we also need to recognize how much work lies ahead." He shared his story, detailing the events leading to his wrongful arrest and the lessons he had learned through the process. But he didn't stop there. He opened the floor to others, encouraging those who had experienced their own injustices to share their stories. One by one, people stood up, recounting painful experiences of profiling, bias, and fear. The stories poured out, filling the room with a mix of heartache and resilience. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted from one of individual pain to collective determination. The community began discussing actionable steps, proposing the formation of a citizens' advisory board to work alongside the police department. They called for regular training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques for officers, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability. In the weeks that followed, the momentum continued to build. The Citizens Advisory Board was officially formed, consisting of a diverse group of residents, community leaders, and even a few officers willing to engage in meaningful dialogue. They met regularly, brainstorming initiatives aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and the community. But change wasn't easy. Resistance from some quarters of the police department remained strong. Officer Harris, though officially removed from the force, had supporters who were vocal about their discontent with the reforms being proposed. Some claimed the community was overreacting, that crime rates would rise without the firm hand of law enforcement. But Marcus and his allies remained undeterred, engaging with even the staunchest opponents and inviting them to the table for dialogue. One evening, as Marcus was leaving a meeting, he noticed a group of young people standing outside, some wearing hoodies, others in casual attire. They were from the local high school, and Marcus recognized a few of them from the basketball games he had attended with Jasmine. Their faces were a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Hey, Sergeant Turner," one of the boys called out, stepping forward. "We were wondering if you could help us organize a youth rally for justice. A lot of us feel like we need to make our voices heard too." Marcus felt a swell of pride. "Absolutely. I'd love to help. It's important for your generation to be involved in this conversation." They brainstormed ideas for the rally, planning to focus on education and empowerment. The youth aimed to make it a family-friendly event, inviting parents and community members to participate. They wanted to create a safe space for dialogue, to discuss their fears, hopes, and dreams for the future. The day of the youth rally arrived, and the energy in the air was palpable. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, and booths were set up with information about community resources, legal rights, and ways to get involved. Music played, laughter echoed, and the spirit of hope permeated the atmosphere. Marcus stood on stage, looking out at the crowd of young people and their families. He felt a deep sense of purpose as he spoke. "Today is about you, about your future. This is your chance to make a difference and be heard. You are the leaders of tomorrow, and the changes we make today will shape the world you inherit." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus couldn't help but smile. The youth spoke passionately about their experiences and their vision for a better Ridgeview. They shared their hopes for a community free of fear and filled with opportunities for all. As the rally concluded, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. The event had been a success, and the engagement from the younger generation was inspiring. But as he walked home that evening, a nagging worry crept back into his mind. The journey for justice was ongoing, and while they had made strides, he knew there were still battles ahead. The following week, a meeting was scheduled with the police department to discuss the recommendations made by the Citizens Advisory Board. Marcus felt a mix of excitement and trepidation as he prepared to step into the conference room. He was acutely aware that this was a pivotal moment for the community. As he entered the room, he was greeted by familiar faces: community leaders, members of the advisory board, and several officers, including those who had supported the reforms. But seated at the end of the table was the new police chief, a woman named Chief Sarah James, who had been appointed after the turmoil surrounding Harris's resignation. She was known for her commitment to community policing and had expressed a willingness to engage in meaningful reform. "Thank you all for coming," Chief James began, her voice steady. "I know this town has been through a lot, and I believe we have an opportunity to build a stronger relationship between the police and the community. I'm here to listen and learn." Marcus spoke first, outlining the board's recommendations: transparency in policing practices, community outreach programs, and regular training on racial sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. As he spoke, he could see Chief James nodding, taking notes and asking insightful questions. When the discussion turned to the need for accountability, he felt a surge of passion. "We can't just say we're committed to change. We have to put structures in place that ensure our officers are held accountable for their actions. The community needs to trust that the police are on their side, not against them." Chief James responded thoughtfully. "I agree wholeheartedly. We're working on implementing a system for community feedback on officer conduct, and I want to involve the advisory board in these discussions." The room buzzed with energy as ideas flowed back and forth. They discussed establishing regular community forums where residents could voice their concerns and suggestions. The conversation was constructive, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of optimism that meaningful change was possible. As the meeting concluded, Marcus stepped outside to join Lena, who was waiting for him. "How did it go?" she asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I think it went really well," Marcus replied, his heart swelling with hope. "Chief James seems genuinely committed to working with us. This might be the start of something good." Lena smiled, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm so proud of you. This is just the beginning. You're making a real difference." As they walked home hand in hand, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The journey had been difficult, but through the support of his family, friends, and community, he had found his voice and purpose. They had weathered the storm together, and now they were standing at the precipice of change. Ridgeview was evolving, and so was Marcus. He had transformed from a soldier into a leader, a beacon of hope for his community. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be filled with challenges, he knew they would face them together, united in their pursuit of justice, equality, and a brighter future for all. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.